Hey everyone! This is no longer a war that sits inside Gaza and waits for the rest of the region to react. It is already spreading across the map, and the most dangerous part is not just the number of fronts. It is the collapsing illusion of control. Leaders are still talking as if this can be managed in limited, careful steps, while missiles, drones, militias, airstrikes, and shipping threats are stacking at the same time. That is not a routine expansion. That is where the public story starts to break. Because the simple version says these are separate flare-ups tied together by one rival. Gaza here, Tehran there, Hezbollah on one border, Houthis in another corridor, militias in Iraq acting on their own clock. But based on the public record so far, that story looks thinner by the hour. What this looks like now is a connected war system under stress, where one strike in one theater raises the chance of retaliation somewhere else entirely. And once pressure starts jumping fronts like that, control is not getting stronger. It is getting harder to prove. Look at the scene people are being asked to treat as normal. Missiles from Yemen aided from Israeli jets hitting weapons facilities in Tehran. Hezbollah launching around 250 projectiles from Lebanon in a single 24-hour stretch, drone attacks near U.S. positions in Iraq, smoke over infrastructure, air defenses firing through the night, ships rerouting, traders watching the sea lanes, families far from any front lines still waiting to find out what this does to fuel, freight, and prices. That is not a contained war. That is a regional chain reaction already in motion. And here is the detail that makes this more dangerous than many pipette. Gaza never cooled down while the rest of the map heated up. Israeli airstrikes have continued in Gaza despite a fragile ceasefire environment, even as the military focus widened outward. So this is not one war ending and another beginning. It is not a neat sequence. It is conflict layered on top of conflict. Gaza stays hot while Tehran gets hit. Lebanon keeps firing while Yemen reopens the maritime threat. Iraq remains unstable while U.S. forces sit inside the risk field. The old battlefield does not close, new ones simply ignite around it. That is when escalation stops looking linear and starts looking contagious. And once that happens, the next front is not a surprise, it is a probability. The abnormal detail that blows this open even further is Yemen. The Houthis have re-entered the war more directly, and that matters for a reason much bigger than any single missile launch. The Bab el-Mandeb Strait is tied to about 12% of global trade. The Strait of Hormuz remains under separate pressure from Iran. So this is no longer just about where rockets land or who claims another strike. This is about whether two of the most sensitive maritime choke points on Earth start looking unstable at the same time. That is how a regional war starts exporting pain far beyond the region. Not through speeches, through rerouted cargo, rising insurance costs, delayed shipments, shaken energy markets, and a global transfer of costs that hits people who will never see the battlefield. That alone would be serious. But this is where it gets worse. The military message from every side is strength. The political reality underneath it is exposure. Every successful strike every intercepted missile still proves the next wave can come. Every widened front gives another government a reason to say it is acting defensively, even while the map tells a more dangerous story. Because if you are striking Tehran, taking fire from Lebanon, watching Yemen reopen a shipping corridor threat, and reinforcing U.S. positions because Iraq may not stay quiet, then the claim that this is still narrowly bounded is getting harder to sell with a straight face. And the human cost is already ripping through that claim. More than 30,000 people have reportedly been killed across the widening conflict. In Lebanon, healthcare workers and civilians have been among the dead. U.S. troops have been wounded and killed. This is not a board game for strategists and television panels. It is a live regional trauma spreading through cities, bases, border towns, hospitals, ports, and supply routes. And once wars begin multiplying faster than diplomacy can contain them, the next mistake does not become less likely. It becomes easier. This is where the map stops being a map and starts becoming a trap. Because once a conflict expands across Gaza, southern Lebanon, Tehran, the Red Sea, Iraq, and the Gulf at the same time, you are no longer looking at separate crises that can be handled one by one. You are looking at a system of linked pressure points. One front does not calm another. One front activates the next. A strike in Tehran sharpens Hezbollah's incentives in Lebanon. Houthi fire from Yemen puts the shipping question back on the table. Militia threats in Iraq turn every U.S. position into a possible message board written in rockets and drones. That is not ordinary spillover. That is convergence. And that is where official calm begins to sound like performance. Take Lebanon, because this is where the promise of a limited war starts colliding with visible reality. When thousands of troops are operating across the border, when combat drags on for weeks, and when the stated objective reaches to the Litani River, roughly 20 miles inside Lebanon, that is not a quick punitive action dressed up as border security. That is a much larger military and political statement. And once you move into that kind of ground campaign, every assurance about a narrow operation starts to wear thin. Because buffer zones and temporary security belts have a habit of staying long after the politicians who announce them. Tactical confidence starts turning into strategic debt, and history is full of governments that discovered too late that the territory they entered easily became the pressure point they could not leave cleanly. The visible cost of that front is already brutal. Hezbollah fired around 250 projectiles in a single day. Israeli strikes in Lebanon killed journalists, paramedics, and other civilians, while dozens more were wounded. Lebanon's reported death toll since early March climbed above 1,100. So when officials still use the language of containment, ask what that word is even worth now. Because if the bodies keep piling up and the front keeps widening, containment is not containment. It is escalation cleaned up for public consumption. But the deeper turn in this whole story is not Lebanon by itself. It is the sea lanes. The Houthis are back in the war more directly, and that changes the economic equation because Bab el-Mandeb is not some obscure line on a naval map. It is a global artery. More than 100 merchant vessels were attacked in earlier Houthi campaigns. So when missiles start flying again from Yemen toward Israel, the threat is not just another militia headline. The threat is that one more front now sits directly on top of a major trade route, while Hormuz remains under separate pressure from Iran. Two choke points. One war system. That is how a battle and once a war starts touching trade this way, the American role gets much harder to disguise. The United States has already reinforced the region with 2,500 Marines and paratroopers from the 82nd Airborne. More than 300 U.S. troops have reportedly been wounded and at least 13 killed. That is not a spectator posture. That is not distant backing from outside the danger zone. U.S. forces are already inside the risk field, and every new Iraqi militia move, every drone crossing, every strike near a base raises the chance that an already widening war finds a faster route into direct American escalation. That is the contradiction people should be staring at. Washington wants to deter expansion while sitting inside the machinery that could accelerate it. And here is the deeper fracture line that makes all of this even less stable. Diplomacy is still moving. Regional powers have met in Pakistan. Iran rejected one U.S. ceasefire proposal and offered its own terms. At the same time, governments are reinforcing positions, widening operations, and talking publicly as if force will create leverage faster than it destroys room for compromise. That may be the intent. But intent is not outcome. When diplomacy and escalation run in parallel under this much pressure, it usually means the people closest to the crisis know the situation is much less stable than the public performance suggests. In other words, the calm language is not proof of control. It may be evidence of how badly everyone needs the appearance of control. And that may be the most dangerous layer of the whole crisis. Because every front now gives the next front a reason to ignite, while every government involved still behaves as if it can choose the pace. But what happens when the pace is no longer theirs to choose? What this war is exposing now is not just a region on fire. It is a region losing the boundaries that once kept each fire from becoming one larger blaze. Gaza did not stay in Gaza. Southern Lebanon did not stay on the border. Yemen did not stay on the Jurat. Did not stay and once those lines start collapsing at the same time, the language of limited operations and controlled escalation starts sounding weaker by the hour. Because this is no longer only about who can strike whom. It is about who can still stop the spread. The military logic sounds simple on paper. Hit harder, push deeper, break the other side's confidence, force restraint through pain. But the political reality looks uglier every day. Every strike that proves reach also proves vulnerabilities. Every successful every new front opened in the name of deterrence creates another doorway for retaliation. Visible power is expanding at the same time real control is getting harder to demonstrate. That is the contradiction at the center of this war. And it is not a small one. It is the engine of the danger. Look across the region and the pattern becomes hard to ignore. Smoke over Gaza, rockets from Lebanon, missiles from Yemen, drones and militia threats around Iraq, traders watching oil routes, ships rerouting, insurers recalculating, commanders mating faster than they pan puff, civilians absorbing the cost in blood, fear, displacement, shortages, and uncertainty. This is not a clean military sequence. It is a pressure network. One shock moves another. One retaliation rewrites the calculation somewhere else. One side's signal becomes another side's trigger. That is why the official calm feels so fragile. Because once a war touches shipping lanes, energy markets, border populations, U.S. deployments, and regional prestige, all at once, calibration becomes a very dangerous word. At that point, leaders are not ready to be they're choosing which risk they are willing to make worse first. And if this keeps expanding, the next phase may not be defined by the biggest explosion or the most dramatic headline. It may be defined by the first moment when one side decides it can no longer afford restraint without looking weak. That is how wider wars become easier to enter than to exit. Not always through one spectacular decision, sometimes through a chain of smaller decisions that all look temporary until the trap is already closed. That is the danger. And there is another one. The public is often told that regional wars can be managed like a ladder, one rung at a time, one signal at a time, one warning at a time. But wars that jump fronts do not always climb in order. Sometimes they lurch. Sometimes they skip steps. Sometimes the move that matters most is the one made under humiliation, panic, or domestic pressure after leaders have run out of room to look patient. That is when confidence becomes a liability. That is when deterrence starts competing with desperation. That is when the next mistake becomes easier to make. That is when the next mistake hides. So the deepest unresolved question is no longer whether the war has already expanded. It has. The real question is whether anyone involved still has a believable off-ramp before the next round of pressure forces a choice that cannot be walked back. Can Israel widen the battlefield without locking itself into a longer regional confrontation? Can Iran absorb pressure without feeling compelled to prove response? Can the United States reinforce and deter without being dragged deeper by the very fronts it is trying to stabilize? Can diplomacy survive while every military move keeps draining its oxygen? That is what remains unresolved. And that is why this story is bigger than the latest strike, the latest launch, or the latest official statement. Leave your perspective in the comments, but keep it serious. Because this is not a story for slogans or fantasy. It is a live test of whether a regional war can still be slowed before it becomes something larger, harsher, and far less controllable. Watch the next development closely, because the next shift may not be the loudest one, It may be the one that closes the last open door. And subscribe so you do not miss the next turn, because the story is still moving and the next move could matter more than everything that has happened so far.